I was cleaning my studio a couple of weeks ago when I found a box of old cassette recordings. Stories I heard from travellers many years ago. I became interested in travellers when I was a young boy, observing the exotic nature of their life in barrel-top wagons along a narrow road beside the golf links in Cavan. Children my own age who didn't go to school but sat in shelter tents made of canvas, tossed over wattles that had been soaked in the ditch and then solidly built. Calm and cosy children staring out at me as I cycled by. Occasionally, one of the men would address me with the common salutation of the time, "Good lad." And I'd stop and converse with him, standing there beside me bike. And he'd ask me where I was from, and I'd point back at the rear windows of our house. I'd ask him if those were his children, pointing at the dirty faces gazing out from the tent, and he'd laugh and say, "Yes, them is all mine." Such simple interactions fired me to learn more about these semi-nomadic children. And years later, I was thrilled to become writer-in-residence for 3 months with the Irish traveller movement in Tullamore. I had just become a father and realised that a child was the most important thing in my life. I stayed in a barge on the canal and wandered into the halting site every morning with a tape recorder, listening to romantic stories of long-ago weddings, when the bride wore Wellingtons, or when an old tartan shawl adorned her shoulders, and a few grains of rice was the only confetti thrown over a new couple in the churchyard. I heard of children born under wagons and in shelter tents, or in the back of a van. My own mother lived lavishly among her teapots and vases of flowers, and her golf clubs poised in the garage, but she loved her children. So it was amazing for me as a child to realise that these traveller women held their children with the very same tenderness. I heard one story of a woman who gave birth in Mullingar during the war, when the hospital windows were all boarded up. She discharged herself in the middle of the night. The child was stillborn. And then halfway home to Kinnegad, she asked her husband to stop the van because, to her astonishment, another child was coming. A twin to the stillborn, surprising her on the road. And as I listened, she pointed at a big man passing the window of the trailer and said, "That's him now." Such moments moved me because when I was a boy, I felt travellers were strange and different. But when I befriended them, it was their similarity that astonished me. And it wasn't just about being a parent. I soon realised that I could learn as much from those elderly women about storytelling as I could ever learn in a decade of university courses. And their unrestrained exuberance for storytelling completely changed me as a writer and showed me how bearing witness to one's own life is the core of a writer's destiny. I remember one story about a woman who had an altercation with a shopkeeper. She was holding a baby in her tartan shawl, and the shopkeeper insisted she had concealed a turnip beneath the very same cloth. He followed the traveller out of the shop, shouting for the guards. The traveller woman calmly spread the tartan rug on the pavement, laid the baby safely down on it, and then picked up a turnip from the street stall and flung it through the shop window. The guards arrived, and the traveller ended up in Mountjoy for a month. But it was the calm with which she placed the child on the rug that alerted me. The detail gave psychological intent to the drama, a detail that Chekhov might have been proud of. As I listen to the tapes today, I can still hear a wonderful music in the recordings. Phonetically, the stories contain complex cadences and rhythms, and are as musical as any song. And when I think back on those mornings in trailers long ago, I realise how fortunate I was to meet folks who knew that bearing witness to one's own experience of life is the most authentic pathway for the storyteller. It's no wonder I cherish those tapes, and that they are all dusted down now and sit proudly on the top shelf. And I'm speaking to you from that very studio. And when I read back on that, and I think about my time in Tullamore, well, the first thing that frightens me is that it's so long ago. It's nearly 30 years ago. Because my child was very young at the time. She was a baby. And there was a wonderful woman, a travelling woman, and she'd look at the baby as a big, big girl. And she'd always say, she was joking now, this was a joke. But she'd always look at it, she'd say, would she not give you a bye, child, next time? But she was joking. And she had a great sense of humour, this particular woman, Julia. And it was her that told me that amazing story about the twins. You know, where she was in Cavan Hospital and it was all closed up. It was during the war. And when the stillborn happened, she was so distressed. She insisted she got somebody to contact her husband, and the husband came in that night. It was in the middle of the night by the time he got there. She just wanted to go home. She was, you can imagine, like, you know, travellers weren't used to going to hospitals to have babies, and she goes to a hospital and the baby is stillborn, and she'd be, you know, wrongly thinking that maybe it's because... So she wanted to get out of the hospital, and she went home, and on her way home, somewhere between... Because she told me it was Cavan Hospital, funny enough, but I don't know where they were halting at the time. And then on her way home, she realised she was having the second twin. And she told me another story, because she had, I think, 17 children, but she told me another story about a child that died. And I used to quote this story so often when I'd be doing workshops on writing. I do creative writing workshops, let's say at Listowel Arts Festival or wherever. And I'd always use this story because the woman in question, Julia, she said there was a moment where she was with the baby and she knew there was something wrong, she said, because the baby was turning all purple. His little hands and fingers, she says, and the nails of the fingers were going all purple. And the woman that was with her said, you better go down for Mikey, your husband, and tell him to bring you into the doctor. So Mikey came up with a pony and trap and they headed into the doctor. And she said, I knew the baby was alive when I was going in when we were going in on the pony and trap. I knew the baby was alive because I'd give him a little feed out of the breast and he'd take the breast. So I knew he was still alive. And then she said, when she was going in the door, she was holding the baby with her two hands, like reaching it out towards the doctor, and she said, he gave a little stretch in my hands and I knew he was gone. Now that's a very, very moving story. It's a very simple description of life passing away. And I think, again, it has the quality of detail and pathos that you would get maybe in a great writer like Chekhov. I used to see that too when I was reading Tolstoy. And I haven't read Tolstoy now for a while. And you know something? When I finish this podcast, I'll probably go back and read a little bit of Tolstoy. Sometimes you think, ask yourself, have you ever read Tolstoy? And the answer might be no. Obviously, it might be yes. You are an erudite person. Of course, you'd have read, but I hadn't for years. And I used to associate the name Tolstoy with some sort of very high level of intellectual awareness. And I used to think that War and Peace was some sort of really difficult thing to read. And it was only in my 40s that I began to go through War and Peace and realised that the only thing difficult about it was that it was so long. But that sentence by sentence, it was absolutely gorgeously beautiful and simple and wonderful. And I also realised about Tolstoy that, he was writing the same way as somebody might tell a story. It came alive on the page. Now, there's other people come alive on the page. Over the years, there's great writers. I used to love Emily Bronte. I used to love Wuthering Heights. There was some strange mystique in Heathcliff and Catherine, the relationship they had as a couple, the kind of passion they had for each other, was like frightening. And I think it was frightening for a young person to read, I was in my 20s, I read it. And it was like, you see, when you're young, you be kind of frightened by your own sexual drive. Young people, they can be just really lifted out of themselves with the power of their own passion, male and female. The level at which they can love each other physically is astonishing. And what they can sacrifice, I've seen men climb over gates, climb up drain pipes, like anything for the sake of the beloved. And I've seen women sacrifice so much for the sake of a man or a partner, right? And I think that kind of brings with it a sort of a fear, that it's frightening to think that there's parts of your own energy that could control you, that you could be taken over by your own desires or your own passions. And I kind of suspect that maybe, and this is only me being fanciful, but I kind of suspect that Emily Bronte was like that. I used to always think that, maybe she had secret lovers, possibly women, possibly relationships. She was teaching in a school at one stage and she wrote beautiful love letters or love poems. And who were they to? I think they were to some of the senior girls in the school, maybe some of the teachers. But whatever it was in her, it was like I could feel a sense of passion in that Wuthering Heights book coming out, I thought it was beautiful. And there was other writers too, I was astonished when I read, Virginia Woolf, and particularly a book called The Waves. Listen, The Waves, it cannot be explained except to say that it is a kind of there's a flow of consciousness in it, like like the same way as Joyce uses a flow of consciousness. And Joyce uses a flow of consciousness he weaves it around a concept and a kind of a clock of time. So you have a kind of a time in Ulysses, hour by hour, that goes through the night. And you have the concept of Ulysses, who is on a great journey. And so, he uses that as the shape or the structure around which to weave this kind of flow of consciousness. But what Emily Bronte does is she uses it more in the rhythm of the seasons and of aging and time. So she doesn't weave her flow of consciousness around, let's say, a structure, an intellectual structure, but more around the rhythms of nature. And I think that what she does in that book, The Waves, I just think, I don't want to be controversial, but it's one of the absolute great, great masterpieces. And I think probably, I would say listening to it, if you can get it on audiobooks, is probably a wonderful way to hear it, because it's so musical. So there are all these writers, that's just two that come to mind. And there are so many powerful writers in recent years. I love the kind of musicality. I'm not going to go on now about, don't worry, I'm not going to go on about books or something, but Sebastian Barry is a beautiful writer in Ireland. And he always has a great musicality, in the sentences that he writes. So there's a lot of lovely writing available. And it's a lovely leisurely thing to do in August, is to pick one book and say, this is my holiday book. Because I use August as the holiday. I mean, August for me, it shifts gear into something different. And then the year begins again on the 1st of September. And even if you don't, if I take a book for the summer, for those 4 weeks, I mightn't even open it for the first 3 weeks, but I'll have it in my hand, I'll have it on the desk, and if I'm going away travelling somewhere, I will bring it with me. That'll be my little project for the holiday. Now, in all the books that I've read, and I haven't read a lot, but in all the books that I've read or know about, I would have thought that Tolstoy was tricky and difficult. And I was surprised when I got into him and realized how accessible, how so much of Tolstoy is just telling the story. And there was a great writer who died, Edna O'Brien, may she rest in peace, passed away this few days ago. And Edna, I heard her more than once say that what makes writing great is the pulse of a story. Always the pulse of a story. And she did that in every single book. And her books are often praised because, for her courage that she spoke out against the patriarchal system, that she challenged the conservative Catholic culture of the time. And she did that. But sometimes when we praise writers, we can talk too much about them as kind of moral activists and crusaders. So that, she's a great writer because she's a woman and she challenged patriarchy and Catholicism. And the truth is, no, that doesn't make you a good writer at all. The only thing that makes you a good writer is the pulse of a story. And if anybody could do that in The Country Girls and all the Girl with Green Eyes, all the stuff she wrote, that very controversial book, and she was maybe in her 70s when she was writing it, about there was a terrible murder committed in Clare, and she wrote about that and fictionalized the killing. And that was really provocative. But again, she was going for the power of the story. And she did it with another character who was supposed to be like he was supposed to be a war criminal who was on the run from the wars in Serbia, Croatia, and he ends up in Ireland, he ends up in a village, and he's a healer. And all the different people in the village who are going to visit this healer. These are stories, And I loved Edna O'Brien's stories for that reason, that they had this pulse of storytelling. She was a Tolstoy to me. And yes, she did challenge. Her work helped change the world we live in Ireland. But that's not why she's a great writer. She's a great writer not because she was an activist, but because she was a great writer. And she would say it herself, the key to it is that good writing has always got the pulse of a story. Well, I found it then in Tolstoy, but the strange thing was that when I went into a Halton set with travellers, and this was in the early 90s, I had a barge on the canal, and the lady wife, my beloved, and the child would be there in the barge. In fact, we brought the cat. I actually had a cat, a beautiful grey cat. We called him Sammy at the time. And Sammy came and he lived on the barge with us. I was going to be there I spent about 3 months in and out, and then the family came, I think, for about 4 weeks in October maybe into November, which it was a very, very pleasant, warm autumn. And the light you got, the yellow and golden leaves falling, and the stillness of the canal water, it was exquisite. And the cat, we thought, would like it. Well, the cat came on, and he'd be sitting inside in the barge all the rest of it, and that was grand. And then he'd go off for a little walks, a little touring around the place. And one night he went off for his little tour, and he came back late. We didn't know where he was, but he came back, and as he was coming in, jumping from the quay to the boat, he slipped and fell into the water. Now, we were in bed, and we heard the scream as he went down and the splash, and then more yelping, and we realised he's swimming. He's trying to avoid drowning. And I got out of bed, got out quickly out the door, and had a lamp, a torch was shining, and I could see him in the water. And I swear to God, it's the first time I saw a cat swimming. He reached the quay. We pulled him onto it. He was wringing wet. We brought him inside. We wrapped him in towels. We dried him. And he was okay. Now, he was okay that night. And the following day, he wouldn't go out. He was just sitting there inside in the boat, in the barge. He was dry. We felt there was no damage done, so he was okay. And he'd be more used to the barge, we thought, at this stage. But that evening, I remember, about 4 or 5 o'clock, we were feeding him. And I put out maybe, the wet food you'd get in those days in tins. Now, the way we feed cats nowadays is very different. We give them healthy food, different foods, and we don't give them out of tin, we don't give them wet food. We give them lovely real food. But anyway, at the time, I noticed that he was eating a lot. Like more than usual from his plate. He'd always leave some food on the plate. But no, this time he was eating the whole thing. And he ate the whole thing, and then he looked for more. Because he had a way where he used to sit beside the saucer and look up at you and stare at you. and keep his eye focused on you. And I always knew that means he needs a little bit of food. So I gave him more food, and when I was giving him this extra food, I was saying to myself, there's something going on here. But he ate that food. And there was 3 little steps, the barge. Inside the barge, there was a lovely space where there was 2 steps. There was a space where you could sleep, and then there was this kind of dining space. You had the windows on both sides. It was just gorgeous, lovely little boat, all in wood. And then there was 3 steps up that would bring you out onto the deck. And I always remember him going up them steps that evening after he had eaten this huge big feed of cat food. And I says to myself, I don't know if we're going to see that cat again because he's leaving. And I was right. We never saw him again. And I never actually felt that, something bad happened to him. I actually always felt from the moment he went out that door that something good had happened to him. He had gone and he had found maybe a big barn, because, there was loads of farming going on at that time around Tullamore, and there were hay barns and all sorts of grain storage, and, there was loads of places. I felt that a cat could go and be feral and still be minded, still have food, a source, a supply of food. So I didn't worry about him, and I always thought he did well. Anyway, that was the whole context. That's the way we were living at the time. And then in the morning, I'd head off with my tape recorder and my rucksack. I would go into the halting site, and I would be in it for the day. I'd be in it for the day, and an awful lot of the time I would spend in the trailer with a couple who were elderly at the time, Mikey and Julia. And when Julia was telling a story, I was listening to her like she was giving me a master class on how to tell a story. And I absorbed from her the way that she could always use images. Images, And the way sometimes she'd come to a dramatic moment and she'd repeat something 3 times. It wouldn't be like conscious. It'd be just like it would flow out of her, the way she told a story, and full of theatricality. And that's why I say that in some sense I learned more about storytelling from Julia than I could have ever learned if I went to university to study storytelling. And all of it could be summed up in what Edna O'Brien said: good writing always has the pulse of his story. That's all it is. So you can choose what you want to write about. You can choose, like, am I going to write about maybe the oppression of, a particular class of people, maybe about travellers or whoever, black communities who feel, am I going to tell a story about oppression? Am I going to tell a story about sexual desire? Am I going to tell, and there's loads of different stories. There's kind of archetypal stories that you can tell. But the real question is not that you're telling a story, let's say, that challenges the oppressive culture of Ireland or anywhere else. The real core of the story is not its political pulse, it's the story pulse. It's just a beautiful way that the story is told. And that's a simple thing. And if you base that on how you speak, if you base it like if I'm telling stories the way I'm talking, then the story will be good. If I'm talking now and I'm telling you this, well, if I was to write like this, that would be the best writing I could do. And there was one other thing that I learned from Julia and from all the travellers that I was with, And that was particularly Julia, because I've told you those two incidences where she's talking about childbirth. And as I say, she had 17 children. So what would she tell stories about? About childbirth. So what do you tell stories about if you want to be a writer? You tell stories about what you know. You don't write a story about, let's say, a lesbian love affair in a prison if you've never been to prison and you're not a lesbian, because you don't know what you're talking about. You try to write about the world that you know yourself. And Julia, she used to illustrate this to me so well, because her world was her family, her children. And some of the boys were big men, like 6 foot tall, big, strong men, and you'd see them moving about. They'd be passing the window, and they'd drop the head into her to chat to her. Are you all right there, or do you want, will I get you messages or something? So she had her family around her, and her storytelling was about family. Ordinary things, but then you go and you read Tolstoy and you realise, it's the same thing. He just tells the ordinary stories. And then I learned in that the most central thing about, if you're going to tell your own story, or if you're going to tell the story that you know best of all, then it is your own story. Your own story. Who are you? And that was a great revelation to me. Because I had been writing books, and I had been writing plays, and they were about things I had passion for. They were about religion, the church, the decline of the clerical system, and the way that, in some sense, I always felt that the clerical system declining was a kind of Chekhovian world. It was like the world that Chekhov described. Chekhov was describing a kind of a petty aristocracy at a certain period where everything is in decline. And I felt, because I was in the clergy, I felt, the clergy, the Catholic clergy are like that. They're on the Titanic, they're sinking and they don't see it, they don't notice it, they're in decline. And that led me to write 3 plays for the Abbey Theatre, Una Puka, Misogynist, and Sour Grapes. Led me to write a book, a kind of a collection of fictions called Priest. So I was writing about the world I knew. But I think in the mid-90s or early 90s, when I met Julia, I had this realization that I was still making up the story. I was still creating fictional characters. And that what I wanted to be doing was what I might do at a dinner table when I'd be talking to somebody. You'd be sharing not just made-up stories, you'd be sharing your own real stories, the stories that actually you had lived through. I found that when I told my story, then that was my best writing. And for that reason, I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to do a big, long chronicle of ordinary life, just as my stories, and share it? And I found an opportunity in the newspaper, in the Irish Times, to do that. And then I began to shape it up into books. And all the memoirs, I cannot believe now that I've completed 9 books of memoir, 9 volumes, if you like. And it's not that my life is important. It's 9 volumes of just chronicling ordinary life and sharing the ordinary stories that make up my life, that I have lived through. And every week in the Times I share a story, but it's something that I lived through in the previous 2 or 3 weeks. Sometimes it's from memory that I've lived through. and remember. And those are the ways that I think I've discovered telling my story is the best way for me to make good writing. And then what happened was, just accidentally, after about 5 years of writing these stories in the Irish Times, I got physically sick and exhausted. I was overdoing it, as one does in your 50s. I was overdoing it. You know, I was doing one-man show, and I'd be touring the country with it, and at the same time I was writing for the Times and doing loads of other stuff. So I was doing too much, and I got ill, and I kept working even though I was ill. So I was suffering from a big chest infection, and I'd still be out on the road doing shows at night, maybe 2 shows a week. So I'd take steroids. I got the doctor to prescribe me steroids that would kind of give energy to your lungs. And I used to be so exhausted that I started suffering from pain in the back and all sorts of terrible things. And eventually I ended up in hospital. And I was burnt out. And they fixed me up in hospital. This is 2011, 15 years ago, or 13 years ago. They fixed me up. But when I came out, I fell into depression. And I had never in my life been depressed. I had been melancholic. I liked being melancholic. I still like being melancholic. It's a mood in me that I like. But I had never, ever thought about myself as being depressed. Well, I was so burnt out that I couldn't avoid the reality I was depressed because I wasn't able to get out of the bed. There was about a year went by where getting out of the bed even in the morning was a struggle. I would just want to lie there in misery. And it's like losing your mind. I used to feel that I was in this strange world that nobody else was in it with me. This world where I felt so wretched and nothing could give me joy. And it felt like a trap. You know, Sylvia Plath, I had read her book years and years and years ago. It's called The Bell Jar. And she describes it like, you know, a big glass bell jar coming down and enclosing you, like the way you'd trap a bee in a jam jar. And that's the way she described her bouts of mental disturbance. And I remembered back to that book and I thought, you know, that's very like what I feel. And that again would frighten you further because you begin to think, well, maybe I'm worse than I think. And where will this depression end up? Oh, it was frightening. And the real challenge that I had was, what do I write about now? If I've already done 6 years writing for the Irish Times and I'm chronicling ordinary life and I'm sharing the stories that happen to me and I live through from week to week, and now I'm depressed, what am I going to do? Am I going to sort of pretend, make up stories for the weekly column and just pretend I'm happy? And I knew, well, I can't do that. That would be silly. So I actually either stop writing the column, give it up as a writer, or else tell the story and share the experience of being depressed. Well, that was scary, and people praised me when I started doing it and writing about that. They'd say, oh, you've great courage to write about it. But you see, I had no choice. My only choice was, do I give up writing? Do I go silent? And that's death to a writer. I don't know how that could possibly be an option for a writer, a storyteller. You decide, well, I'm no longer going to tell stories because I'm afraid to tell the truth. So I had kind of no option but to persevere and share stories, and I did. And as I said then, in those books that came out, 9 of them, I sort of began to track my journey. So I didn't know from year to year what I would be writing about. But as I lived through various experiences of depression, and then I lived through a beautiful time of coming out of depression. My fear, and I think it's a fear that everybody who suffers from depression, always the fear is that you'll never get out of it. You know, that you're in a bell jar, that you're isolated in your own little strange world where you feel wretched, and that there's nothing can ever change the world. You're going to be like that. This is it forever. You're going to grow old like this. You'll never recover the joy that you had. And I used to feel that fear, that insecurity. And the most consoling thing that people would say to me, my beloved, my wife, my family, the most consoling thing they said would be this sense of, yes, you will get out of it, of course you will. I would keep repeating that question all the time. I'd be saying, am I going to get out of this? And people would say, yes, of course you are. And I used to believe them rather than me. And in that way they pulled me out. Their faith in my future transformed me because I lived up to what they believed. Isn't that really interesting? I lived up to what they believed. And it's not what I believed, it's what they believed. That was a really, really... And I wrote about that in... there's a book called Talking to Strangers, and there's a book called On Tuesdays I'm a Buddhist. And it carries me through that period of my life where initially psychotherapy, was a great help, and I was fortunate enough there was a great therapist who was working with young people and working in Dublin. He was in the media. Tony Bates is his name, and he's written a beautiful memoir about a year ago. But he was in communication with me at the time, and he recommended me to a therapist, a good therapist. And she was wonderful, and I worked with her for about 3 years. You know, for a season, like maybe September to Christmas, I'd go see her weekly. And I did that maybe 1 year, then maybe the next year I did it again. And then I skipped a year, and then maybe the following year I did it even again. Until I'd worked out all the stuff that you need to work out with a therapist. You know, it's a good thing to go to a therapist at some stage if you have things that you feel, I'd be lighter if I spoke about this to somebody. So I did that with her. But what I did also find at that time was another need in me, a need that I had nurtured as a child, I had nurtured when I went to the seminary, I had nurtured when I was a practicing priest, and I had nurtured for years when I was studying with a Tibetan Lama and travelling to Mongolia, making pilgrimages and being involved in the services and the prayers and the life of a Buddhist centre. So I'd nurtured something within me, and somewhere along the way, for a couple of years, for 4 or 5 years, I had forgotten it. I had abandoned it. And then I burnt out, and then I was depressed, and I realised, you know something, not just therapy, but I need to go back and nurture this thing called faith. Now, I don't know where this podcast is going for the past 45 minutes, but it's been a lovely moment of sharing with you spontaneously because I didn't think it would go in this direction. But again, I think that it's one of the good things about storytelling is if you can find a spontaneity in you. And this brings me to one of the most important things in my life, and that is faith. And I think that, to be honest with you, I speak a lot about the beauty of Islam, of the Sufi tradition, and the great writer Rumi comes in to my mind an awful lot. But I think of Judaism deeply, the sense of presence you get in the philosophy of Judaism, and also the fact that the whole scriptures that we use as Christians, there's a link. For me, there's a huge link between Judaism and Christianity. It's like nearly the one religion. You know, it's like for the Jew, he's not going to come along the whole road with me in the recognition of Jesus Christ. But that's okay. We're really very, very close in what we understand about the nature of transcendent being. And there's links in the rituals. However, having said those three religions, they all are what they call religions of the book. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all using Moses and Abraham and the insights and revelations of God to Moses, to Abraham, to all that tradition of the prophets of Israel. And that's all there. That's all like my core tradition is Christianity. And I see my Christianity as my core faith. That is my one singular faith. But I also see around it, like a scaffolding, the beautiful architecture of Buddhist ideas and philosophy. The Buddhist ideas and philosophy are to me like the Greek philosophers were to Christians of the early Christian period. Christians of the early Christian period, they used the ideas of Plato and other great Greek philosophers to structure, to scaffold the jewel of their faith, the resurrection. And I do the same with Buddhism. Because Buddhism is simply philosophy. Buddhism is simply psychotherapy. Buddhism is not a revealed religion. Buddhism is like ways and tactics and mechanics of how to be in the world, how to meditate, how to be detached, how to be compassionate, the exercises, practices. It's a very, very brilliant sort of way of training the mind. And I find that you can do that with Buddhism while holding Christ as the focus, as the mentor deity. So therefore everything in Buddhist tradition is enabling me to dwell more deeply in the presence of Christ. And that's not taking away from anything in Buddhism, because Buddhism is not suggesting that you should be doing anything more. Buddhism is precisely that. It's a way of being present. And then the focus will be your mentor deity. Very often in Buddhism it would be a particular deity, like Tara, the female Buddha, the white Tara. It might be Shenrezhi, it might be Manjushri. These are all, Manjushri is the Buddha of wisdom, Shenrezhi of compassion. And those kind of focus, mentor deity as a focus, as a lens into enlightened presence, enlightened being, It is something that happens in Buddhism, where the scaffolding will hold at the center a focus. And so there's nothing unusual in putting Christ at that focus. And when I put Christ at that focus, I'm putting Christ at that focus with all the faith that any traditional Orthodox Christian would have. I'm surrendering to all the wisdom of the tradition that goes back to the apostles to say, I don't understand 99% of it, but to the extent that I do understand it, I embrace it as the true revelation of God. And I feel that is a gift that somebody gave to me, And I have to think about, well, who gave it to me? Who gave me the gift of faith? And I suppose one person would be my mother, my father, my teachers, the first teachers I had when I went to learn to read, when I went to infants' school as a child, as an infant, and later the primary school teachers, and secondary, and right up to university, and then right up to people like spiritual teachers, like my Rinpoche, the teacher that I go to in Jampeling. All these teachers were giving me faith. But I had other teachers as well, and they were people who informally taught me through experience. And if the one thing that we can learn through religion is love and compassion, if they are the two nuggets or jewels that you will find at the center of Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, everything is always the same center of love and compassion, to think more about the other person and to realize the divinity in the other person. If that be the case, then the great teachers are people who have, in your experience, shown you love and compassion. And they can be people that you just fell in love with. It could be people that you've met on the street. It can be your neighbours. It can be sometimes people who don't even know you, and yet they're close to you, they're in the neighbourhood, and something happens to them, and they behave in a way that is compassionate or forgiving in their life. And it's like the light comes out of them, and you receive it. I hear of somebody in my locality who's very, very caring and loving to an old person. Not related, and yet minds this old person. And then this old person passes on. And then 5 or 6 years later, I noticed that the person who was caring for old person number one has now found another old person who's caring for them. And they're just living this life of compassion where they care for people. And I don't know the person that well, but I know they're doing these good deeds, and it's like their good deeds have a light, and the light radiates towards me and makes me feel better and makes me feel want to do good deeds. It makes me feel I need to be more compassionate. Because I can see that compassion is a reality. I can see that compassion is like a light, and it can go on inside you. It's like a joy that'll come into you by being compassionate. It's like, God Almighty, that's an amazing lesson to learn. So they're teachers too. Everybody is your teacher. And then in Buddhism, there's a great and deep and profound concept that when somebody is giving you a hard time, even like in a sustained way, when somebody is giving you a hard time, they're teaching you. I will learn to cherish ill-natured beings and those oppressed by strong misdeeds and suffering as if I had found a precious treasure difficult to find. When others out of envy treat me badly with abuse, slander and the like, I will learn to take all loss and offer the victory to them. So that when you're practicing non-violence in the face of somebody who's aggressive to you, in the face of somebody who says something that's offensive, in the face of somebody who does something wrong to you, neglects you, cheats on you, whatever, that you're learning compassion. So your greatest enemy in life is really your greatest teacher. The person who really just annoys you. Let's say you're at work and in your workspace there's somebody who just gets up your nose, like seriously. I can think of somebody, I can think right now of somebody who just, fine person, I've nothing wrong with them, and yet they get up my nose. I can't stand one particular person I'm thinking of in the minute. And I would be engaged through the literary life with this person, sometimes, occasionally, on and off. Well, they're my best teachers because they call on me to practice kindness and compassion and not to allow myself to be possessed by my darker, wilder, negative energies of anger and hatred. You know, religion is not rocket science. Honest to God, it's simple health, mental health. It seems to me religion is simply mental health. Living a life whereby you will have this light inside you that will give you joy, give you heat, peace, because you have this beautiful, precious jewel. And that mentor deity can be Mary, the Mother of God, or it can be Jesus, or it can be the Buddha, it can be Moses in Jewish tradition, anybody. But to have a mentor deity, to have a relationship with the transcendent ground of being through the lens of the God, if you like, that reveals. Now, I know that a conservative Christian would say, well, that's wrong because it is exclusively Christ. And when I stand in the space of Christ, in the Christian space, in the church, I agree with that. It's a strange way whereby all religions are at one level contradictory and at another level completely saying the one thing. So from the Christian perspective, it is exclusively Christ and only Christ in whom you will find salvation. That's fine. But the same absolute perspective exists in other religions as well. And that might look like they're contradictory, but in another strange way, each center of the universe is the one center of the universe. And each perspective is the one perspective. And if I meet my brother, the Jew or the Muslim, then the more devoted they are to their truth, the closer I will be to them, because the more I will understand and share an affinity with them by the fact that I'm devoted to my faith. I didn't mean to get into all this conversation of sharing like this, but it's funny the way it came out of just the narrative of storytelling, which is what I wanted to talk about. And I wanted to share how the traveller has been for me a precious jewel, a teacher of how to tell story. I don't look upon Irish travellers like I'm an activist and I want to do some good for people. I don't see it like that. I look up to them, the individual travellers that I have known as storytellers. I look up to them and admire them for the way that they can use language to tell a story. And that's ultimately what I love to do. So I've been doing it here for the past 60 minutes, exactly. And I'm so lucky that you're there that you're with me. And I will reflect, when I go into August now next week, please God, I will reflect more fervently on some beautiful, beautiful ideas in the Christian tradition, starting with Transfiguration of Christ. It's a feast coming up next Tuesday. So I'll be at all that now a little bit more, and I'll also be kind of in holiday mood for August. And thank you for being here.